Ever think about the people you consider, the hardest to reach, maybe even unreachable, the ones you might instinctively sort of shy away from, or whose beliefs seem just completely fundamentally different from yours?
Yeah, the ones where you think there's just no common ground there.
Exactly. But what if profound transformation, I mean, the kind that really reshapes lives, often begins not in the easy places, but in the most unexpected ones, with those exact individuals?
It feels counterintuitive, doesn't it? We often look for, the open doors, for people who are already receptive.
Right.
But this idea that the greatest results could actually come from the most difficult engagements, well, it's a powerful one.
It really flips your perspective, and that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Mm-hmm.
Our deep dive is based on some honestly incredible excerpts from a chapter called The Hardest People Yield the Greatest Results. It lays out this principle and then, wow, illustrates it with these astonishing true stories.
Yeah, and our mission today is really to unpack this principle through these specific accounts, the ones shared in the source material. We want to pull out the key insights they offer and then try to figure out what they might mean for you at the situations you might face.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The core idea from the source is basically this. Sometimes the person you think is the most difficult, the most resistant maybe to a new idea or message, they can paradoxically become the most dedicated, the most, zealous advocate for it if they somehow come to understand and accept it.
Exactly. And the source contrasts this with what's probably a more common approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Looking for a person of peace, someone who's receptive from the get-go.
Right, the easier target.
Yeah, and it acknowledges that this idea of engaging the hardest people, well, it sounds contradictory on the surface, because these are individuals who might start out not just skeptical, but openly hostile.
And the source actually gives us some historical grounding for this. Going back to biblical examples, it points to Jesus choosing figures you really wouldn't expect.
Oh, right. Like who?
Well, think about Matthew, a tax collector. I mean, seen as a traitor by his own people, working to the Romans.
Okay, yeah. Definitely an outcast.
And Simon the Zealot, who was potentially from a radical group known for violence, and then, of course, later Paul, who was actively, violently persecuting the early followers of Christ before his own radical turnaround.
Wow. Yeah, those examples from the source really force you to question our typical filters, don't they?
Right.
About who's reachable or, capable of profound change. They weren't exactly the obvious candidates.
Not at all. Absolutely. And speaking of individuals who seemed utterly unreachable, the source spends quite a bit of time on the story of a man named Zuti. He was known as the bulletproof man.
Oh, that description is vivid and frankly pretty chilling. The source paints this picture of Zuti as someone who maybe not physically huge, but just had this overwhelming, frightening presence.
Yeah, someone you'd definitely cross the street to avoid, it says.
And his background kind of explains why. He was a prominent member, even a leader, of this group of fighters in his African country. And they were deeply involved in the occult, what the source calls traditional religions, basically local spirit worship.
Right, so not just a fighter, but spiritually powerful in a dark way.
Yeah, their preparation for battle involved performing all these occultic rites and rituals, trying to get power and protection from the spirit world. And their reputation was built on just sheer fearlessness in combat.
The source describes them acting almost like mercenaries, like special forces for their side during a war, charging into battle in this kind of berserk rage, engaging in indiscriminate killing.
And their weapons were this bizarre mix, too, weren't they? Like modern AK-47s and RPGs right alongside old British rifles, Colt pistols, and even really primitive stuff like sticks, rocks, spears, machetes.
It's wild. And there's that horrifying detail the source includes about conscripting young boys, some as young as 12. Their minds dulled by chewing khat, that's a stimulant plant, and their spirits just seemingly deadened by all this involvement in demonism. It's awful.
Truly awful. And Zuti was the model for these fighters. He'd lead the charges, sometimes naked apparently, with this strange head covering made of like a patchwork of occultic animal skins.
But the source says what was really terrifying about him was his presence, that look in his eyes.
Yeah.
Described as a zealot's gleam, a fixed, snarling grin, a total lack of humanity. The source literally says you would have felt you were looking at a man who had no soul.
Wow. Chilling.
He'd gained fame and boasted constantly about being invincible. He claimed he'd never lost a battle, fought naked, and that bullets literally bounced off him, said he didn't need body armor.
And he was apparently very open about where he thought this power came from, the world of the dead, achieved through performing these horrible rituals.
His religious context adds another layer, too. He was Muslim, but from a family background of what the source calls folk Islam.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It describes it as a syncretistic mix, so blending Islam with animism. He might do daily prayers, read the Quran, but also deeply believe in traditional local spirits and nature worship.
Right, so a blend of traditions. And his home reflected this mix, apparently filled with a huge array of occult items, totems, masks, statues, talismans, things believed to hold spiritual power.
Yeah, the source even adds this little cautionary note about how dangerous it is just to own stuff like that.
Interesting. And his view of God was incredibly distorted, wasn't it?
Totally. He wasn't submitting to God. He seemed to think he had God or, whatever gods were involved under his control. Like he was manipulating them to do what he wanted. He basically set himself above God.
So he genuinely believed nothing could harm him. He dared people to shoot him.
Yes. That's what the source says. And the fear he inspired wasn't just physical. Women apparently feared becoming barren or having miscarriages if his shadow just fell on them.
Whoa.
And men would warn people, he can just speak and things happen. He ruled his whole region through this kind of terror. Nobody dared challenge him.
Okay, so this guy sounds absolutely terrifying and unreachable. Until,
as the source describes it, the Christians arrived. A man named James and his co-workers moved into the town. They initially came looking for that person of peace, praying a lot, researching, getting to know people, ministering to local Muslims. And as they did all this, Zuti's name just kept coming up.
Right. So they couldn't ignore him.
No. And James felt this really clear sense of direction. He felt, as the source puts it, the Lord is leading us to this man Zuti, so to Zuti we must go.
Wow, that takes courage. So they went to meet him.
Yeah, the initial meeting wasn't hard to set up. Zuti wasn't shy. But the interaction quickly got intense when James and his team started sharing stories from their scripture.
How did he react?
Explosively. The source says his hackles rose. He started shouting right there in the coffee house, "Man, what are you telling me? You have nothing to tell me." And then he immediately launched into boasts about his own power.
Oh, like what?
Things like, "I can perform anything you can perform. If God heals, I heal. If God shouts and there is thunder, I will shout and you will hear thunder." And the source notes that people in the local folklore actually believed he could do these things.
Incredible arrogance.
And then he made these truly shocking claims like, "I have eaten human beings," standing over them furious, boasting about his power, his fearlessness. "Do you know who I am? I am a leader of battles. To be what I am, you must have no fear. I say to the devil, come, and he comes. I have power. I can do anything."
It's just an astonishing picture of, arrogance and darkness. And what really strikes you, reading this in the source, is the Christians' response to all this hostility.
Right. What did they do?
They weren't disheartened. That's the key thing.
No, not at all. They kept showing up. They continued staying in touch over weeks, months even, meeting for coffee, gently trying to share scripture stories, and just praying constantly.
Even while Zuti kept ranting at them.
Apparently so. He'd say things like, "There is nothing you can tell me about God. I have God on my back. God is at my beck and call, so what are you going to tell me about God?"
But despite all that, all the arrogance, the blasphemies, the Christians noticed something crucial, didn't they?
Yes. The source really emphasizes this. Zuti kept talking with them. He didn't completely shut the door. And for them, that was enough. Enough reason to keep trying, keep praying.
And then the turning point came. Right there in the coffee house again.
Yeah. While Zuti was in the middle of another rant, something happened. He suddenly gritted his teeth, grabbed his right leg. He was obviously in pain.
Ah, the bulletproof man.
Exactly. The source highlights the irony. This supposedly invincible guy was just, mortal, subject to pain.
So James saw this.
He did. He asked almost casually about the leg. Zuti tried to brush it off. "Oh, it was just an old wound." But then, maybe out of frustration, he admitted nothing he'd tried had worked. Not Muslim herbs, not potions, not any of his traditional spirit stuff.
And he probably realized immediately he'd shown a weakness, right? The source mentions a tense moment.
Definitely tense. Zuti likely feared they'd exploit it. But James, he silently prayed for guidance.
And what did he do?
He made an incredibly bold offer, especially given Zuti's past reactions. He asked, "Would you like us to pray for your leg in the name of our God, Jesus?"
Wow. How did Zuti take that?
Exactly as you'd expect initially. An explosion of angry refusal. "I don't want to know about your God. I don't want to hear about your God. I don't want to have any business with your God." He stood over them, eyes narrowed, fists clenched, breathing hard, wrestling with the pain and this challenge.
So a real confrontation.
A huge one. The source describes it as Zuti reaching this critical crossroad, facing a choice with potentially eternal consequences. And then something just shifted.
What happened?
His whole demeanor changed. His face softened, his hands unclenched, he wiped sweat off his brow, and he made this concession, lowering his voice. But if you want to pray, go ahead and pray.
He actually let them,
Yeah.
after all that.
He did. And in that moment, James acted, grabbed Zuti's leg, prayed loudly, his coworkers right there supporting him. Zuti just stood frozen, watching. And then he whispered, almost in disbelief, "It is gone. It is gone."
The pain just vanished
Muttered
instantly.
instantly. The source really captures his reaction, gazing in awe, eyes wide. This pain he'd had for years was just gone. He collapsed back into his chair, just full of wonder.
Amazing.
He kept repeating, "You didn't give me anything to drink, you didn't rub any ointment, no talismans, no wands." He turned to his own companions, who were just as shocked.
So he knew this was different.
Completely. His conclusion was immediate. "I have never seen power like that." He laid his hand on my leg, he spoke healing, and it happened.
And then came the real turning point.
Yes. He lowered his eyes, looked at James, and said, "Okay, you can tell me more about your God."
Wow.
Yeah.
Just wow. From the bulletproof man, daring people to shoot him, claiming God was on his back, to asking to hear more.
It's an absolutely astonishing journey, and the source tells us Zuti eventually did give his life to Christ and was baptized.
Incredible. And his actions right after converting were just as dramatic, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. He went straight home and did this radical house cleaning, emptied his house of all the demonic stuff, totems, masks, everything, made a huge pile right there in the street.
And then he made a very public declaration to the people who used to fear him.
Yes. Called his neighbors together, cried out, "This day I renounce and condemn all that I did and was in the past. This day I turn my back on the devil." People gasped, the source says. "I was a partner with the devil. Now I will have no allegiance except to Jesus. I have given my life to Jesus, and I vow that I will never turn back."
That's incredibly bold. And then he burned the pile.
Set fire to it, threw the ashes in the river. A totally symbolic act. But, as you might expect, an action like that from him, it came at a huge cost.
Right. The village that had lived under his terror, maybe even been complicit.
Yeah.
How did they react?
With open hostility and violence, he was actually forced to flee for his own safety.
But he came back eventually.
He did. And his role now, get this, he planted a church in that very same village.
Yeah. No way.
Yes. The source says he never lost his intensity, his zeal, but it's now completely redirected for the gospel. Describes him now as having a gentle spirit, quiet modesty. Hard to imagine the ruthless warrior he was.
That's amazing. So he's still active.
Very. Leading that church, a key church planter, actively discipling young men from his region, turning them away from the darkness he himself came out of.
Okay, so looking just at Zuti's story, what does the source seem to highlight as the key elements in reaching someone considered that difficult?
Well, based on this account, a few things really stand out. First, the power of just persistence and presence. James and his team didn't give up. Even with the extreme hostility, they just kept showing up.
Right, that consistency must have meant something.
I think so. Second, the importance of a demonstration of power, in this case, the physical healing. It directly challenged Zuti's whole understanding of power and his own perceived invincibility. It was something he couldn't explain away with his old beliefs.
Yeah, that moment of vulnerability, when the pain was real despite the bulletproof claims. Finding that point of connection, even if it's a weakness.
Exactly. And third, the source seems to imply the significance of finding a point where the person is willing, however reluctantly maybe, just to keep the conversation going. Zuti kept talking, even ranting, but he didn't shut them out completely. That tiny open door was crucial.
Persistence, challenging their power structure, finding vulnerability, maintaining the conversation. Those are really powerful takeaways just from his story.
Definitely. And that theme of redirected intense zeal, we see it again in the second major case study in the source, the story of Riyad, who the source calls the bomb maker.
Okay, Riyad. His description in the source starts out sounding respectable, doesn't it? A Muslim imam calling prayer at 4 mosques. People sought his counsel, taught the Quran to nearly 1,500 people.
Yeah, sounds like a pillar of the community. But his true task, the driving force behind his zeal, was much, much darker.
What was it?
The source says his real aim was to rid his town of Christians and ultimately destroy the Christian church in his homeland.
Whoa. So he was using his position.
Actively. using the alms, the contributions from his followers, not just for the mosques, but secretly to buy supplies for making bombs.
And he led raids himself.
Yes, secretly led raids on Christian churches and homes, burning them, setting off bombs, vandalizing, intimidating people. The source describes him as incredibly bold, afraid of nothing, just fueled by this deep hatred for Christ and his followers.
It's chilling, that respected facade hiding such terror. And people knew.
The source says people in the region knew he was responsible, but the government kind of looked the other way because he was so influential. And his Muslim followers, well, according to the source, they didn't see his extremism as wrong. They saw it as acceptable, maybe even virtuous, actions done for Allah.
So the only ones openly responding were his victims, the Christians.
Exactly. And this is where Riyad's story, like Zuti's, takes this really unexpected turn. Their response. It wasn't self-defense or retaliation or cursing him.
What did they do?
The source says they prayed for him.
Prayed for the man bombing their churches.
Yes. Organized prayer campaigns, even all-night meetings, specifically asking God to change Riyad's heart. Or, failing that, to remove him from his position of influence.
And they made these prayers public.
That's crucial. Riyad himself reflected on this later, and the source quotes him. He contrasted what they did with the local custom of cursing enemies or thieves. He actually called the Christians crazy.
Because he couldn't understand it.
He just couldn't wrap his head around why they would pray for him, bless him even, instead of fighting back or cursing him, even while he was actively planning to destroy them further. It just didn't compute in his worldview.
And that incomprehensible response seems to have been key, right?
Yeah.
What was the turning point?
It came when Riyad met some Christians who, astonishingly, asked him to study the Quran with them.
Study his own holy book with the people he was attacking.
Yeah. And Riyad agreed readily. He thought it was a great chance to persuade them to become Muslim.
Ah, okay. But the discussions went differently.
They did. The Christians didn't argue. They gently asked Riyad to explain passages in the Quran that talked about figures also in the Bible, Abraham, Noah, Moses, and especially Jesus. They talked for hours.
And the source notes the irony. Riyad thought he was the teacher.
But he later realized he was the one learning. Over time, this gradual change started happening inside him.
What did he say about that change?
His reflection, quoted in the source, is that he started to realize these Christian men could only understand God if God himself revealed the truth. And that started to shift his own perspective.
Interesting. And then he started seeing his own scriptures differently.
Exactly. He started discovering, or maybe understanding for the first time, Quran verses he already knew but hadn't grasped. Particularly verses about Jesus being a gift, a sign from God. The source quotes one specific verse. God will make of him, Jesus, a revelation for mankind and a mercy from us, God. He knew the words, but suddenly their significance hit him.
And his Christian friends helped him connect that to the Bible.
Yes, they helped bridge that gap from his new understanding in the Quran to the Bible. And as the source puts it very simply, everything became clear.
Wow. So the outcome.
He turned his life over to Jesus Christ. And just like Zuti, he didn't lose that intense zeal. It just got completely redirected.
And his first action was just as bold as Zuti's public declaration.
Not incredibly bold.
Okay.
He went to one of his mosques. Hundreds gathered for prayer, the very community that had supported his attacks.
What did he do?
Stood right in front of them and made this public declaration. The source quotes him. Listen, Jesus is the grace and the truth from God. Unless we follow him, we cannot go to Jannah heaven. So you must come after Jesus if you want to inherit God's kingdom. Jannah being the Islamic term for paradise.
Okay, I can only imagine the reaction to that.
Immediate and violent. The moment he finished, people leaped up, surrounded him, forced him down, tied his hands with scarves, and just started beating and kicking him.
Oh my goodness.
They were yelling at him, calling him crazy, saying he'd gone mad. And while beating him, demanding answers. Who made you leave Islam? Why have you become a Christian? Did they bribe you? Drug you?
Did they kill him?
They held him prisoner there until 3 a.m., but surprisingly, they eventually let him leave rather than killing him. Riyad fled the village. But the next day, a crowd swarmed his house, stole and destroyed everything, including the house itself.
A brutal reminder of the cost. But the source says the persecution actually strengthened him.
Yes, it says he grew even stronger in his faith and understanding through it all.
And his impact since then.
Profound. The source notes that the Lord used him powerfully to lead many Shiites respected religious leaders to Christ. A huge ripple effect.
So the source draws that direct parallel to Paul again. the persecutor becoming the advocate.
Exactly. Like Paul, a violent persecutor became this committed follower because Christians were willing to take that immense risk, engaging someone who was not just difficult, but actively dangerous.
Okay, so thinking about Riyad's journey now, what key lessons does the source emphasize from engaging someone like him?
Well, one huge point is the power of prayer, specifically praying for your enemies with love, like those Christians did. Riyad himself couldn't understand it, and it clearly got under his skin, in a way.
Right, and connected to that, demonstrating genuine compassion and service even to those who hate or harm you. They didn't just pray, they engaged him.
And that strategy of engaging on shared ground, studying the Quran, focusing on figures common to both faiths, that created this unexpected pathway.
Yeah, it wasn't a direct attack, was it? It was more like a gentle inquiry that allowed him to discover truth for himself, within his own context initially, guided by those Christian friends.
Right, and of course the source highlights the core task still remains to share the gospel, understanding that people like Riyad are, in its view, in spiritual darkness and need light.
And the source actually includes specific advice from Riyad himself, doesn't it, for Christians interacting with Muslims?
Yes, born right out of his own experience. He gave 5 points, presented as practical takeaways.
What were they?
First, he said, never hate Muslims. Choose to love them even if they persecute you, hate you, harm you.
Okay, love instead of hate.
Second, pray for them with love because they genuinely don't understand what they're doing. That was his own experience.
Pray with understanding. Got it.
Third, demonstrate genuine compassion. Serve them, share resources, even if they were your enemies. Practical love.
Compassion in action. Makes sense.
Fourth, share the gospel. Understand the issues of spiritual darkness they face and help them discover truth and light. So don't shy away from the core message.
Right. Be direct, but understanding.
And fifth, maybe the most powerful point. Remember that Muslims are in darkness. Riyad said before he believed he was in darkness and didn't even know it. Only God can open hearts and show them the light. Christians share, we collect the harvest, but ultimately, Jesus is the one who brings people to himself.
That's incredibly insightful, especially coming from him. Puts the responsibility in perspective.
It really does. So let's bring us back to you, the listener. Hearing these incredible accounts, Zuti and Riyad, what stands out most to you?
Yeah, what assumptions do these stories challenge in your own mind about who is capable of change? Who might you have written off as, simply unreachable?
And how do they maybe illustrate the potential power of that persistent effort of prayer, of demonstrations of authentic power or love, and just engaging with people even when it feels incredibly difficult or maybe even dangerous?
The aha moment here, I think, is less about a single fact and more about this potential shift in perspective, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
That sometimes, maybe even often, the greatest impact, the most profound transformations aren't found by looking for the easy path, but by stepping outside our comfort zone and daring to engage with those individuals we might instinctively label as the hardest or even the impossible.
Because as these stories from the source really vividly show, those are sometimes the very individuals who, once reached, become the most incredibly dedicated advocates and end up creating the most far-reaching impact.
Just think about those surprising journeys, Zuti and Riyad. From powerful figures, deeply entrenched in beliefs and practices hostile to their eventual path,
Right.
to becoming these dedicated advocates for their new beliefs, despite the huge personal costs they face.
It really does make you wonder, doesn't it? Who are the hardest people in the context that you are familiar with? Whether that's, personal relationships, your community, maybe even broader societal challenges.
And based on this principle, these insights from the source, what might become possible if you or we applied this idea? What could potentially happen if there was that willingness to engage? With compassion, yes, but also with genuine understanding, persistence, and maybe a reliance on a power greater than our own in those situations that seem, well, impossible.
Definitely something to consider as you move forward.